Hey everyone, if you're enjoying our content, hitting that subscribe button brings us one step closer to our goal of 10k subscribers by next year. And remember, every like and comment helps YouTube share these videos with more amazing people like you. I truly appreciate all your support. Now let's dive into today's video. The first anomaly appeared on my screen at 3:47 AM on a bitter Friday morning in December. I'd been staring at lunar topography scans for so long that my eyes burned, but something about this particular reading made my exhaustion vanish instantly. There, beneath the dusty surface of Mare Crisium, was a perfect hexagon, too perfect to be natural. Computer Enhanced Grid Section E379, I commanded, my fingers trembling slightly as I adjusted my screen's resolution. The image sharpened, revealing not just one hexagon, but an intricate network of geometric patterns extending deep below the lunar surface. My heart began to race as I cross-referenced the data with every known geological formation in our database. Nothing matched. I'm Dr. Vesper Blackwood, lead lunar archaeologist for the International Space Research Organization. And in that moment, I knew I was looking at something that would change human history forever. With shaking hands, I reached for my phone to call Director Hassan. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of excitement and disbelief as our most advanced ground-penetrating radar systems confirmed what I'd discovered, an artificial structure roughly 3 kilometers in diameter buried beneath the moon's surface. Early dating suggested it was millions of years old, far older than human civilization itself. But it wasn't until we began detailed scans that the true strangeness emerged. Our equipment kept malfunctioning in peculiar ways. Satellite feeds would cut out at precise intervals. Data files would become corrupted, always at specific coordinates. Most disturbing were the electromagnetic readings, patterns that our scientists said should be impossible in the lunar environment. I remember the exact moment I realized we weren't just dealing with an archaeological find. It was when Dr. Octavia Sterling, our quantum physicist, burst into my office with printouts of the EM readings. Her normally composed demeanor was shattered, her hands shaking as she spread the papers across my desk. "Look at this, Vesper," she said, pointing to a series of wave patterns. "These aren't random interference. They're organized, they're repeating, they're..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "They're active." Active? I felt a chill run down my spine. What do you mean, active? I mean, whatever's down there is still running, still powered, after millions of years. She met my eyes. And I think it's trying to communicate. The implications were staggering. Not only had we discovered evidence of an ancient civilization on the moon, but we'd found something that was still functioning after an impossible span of time. But that was just the beginning of our troubles. None of us could have predicted what awaited us beneath the lunar surface, or the terrible truth about humanity's place in the cosmos. The ISRO facility buzzed with an energy I'd never experienced in my 15 years of lunar research. Within days of our discovery, the organization had mobilized its most ambitious mission ever, the first manned exploration of what we were now calling the Crisium complex. I stood in the observation room watching as our carefully selected team underwent another round of rigorous training simulations. Through the reinforced glass, Commander Kai Matsuda was leading the group through emergency protocols in the gravity chamber. His movements were precise, efficient, the result of 3 successful lunar expeditions. He'd been the obvious choice to lead this mission, though I'd noticed something troubling in his eyes lately when he thought no one was watching. Fear. Dr. Thaddeus Ravencroft, our xenoarchaeologist, was meticulously documenting every detail of the simulation. His theories about non-human architecture had made him a pariah in traditional archaeological circles, but now his expertise seemed prophetic. His tall, lanky frame was hunched over his tablet as he muttered to himself, making connections that only he could see. Dr. Octavia Sterling moved with careful precision through the chamber, her instruments constantly monitoring the quantum fluctuations that had become her obsession since our discovery. She'd pioneered the field of dimensional breach studies, and her recent papers suggested possibilities that bordered on science fiction. But after what we'd found on the moon, science fiction seemed increasingly like science fact. Atlas Quinn, our engineering prodigy, was already modifying the equipment for our mission. At just 28, he'd revolutionized our understanding of xenotechnology adaptation. His fingers danced across control panels with an almost supernatural speed, but I'd noticed dark circles forming under his eyes. He hadn't been sleeping well. None of us had. The problem started small. Equipment would malfunction in ways our technicians couldn't explain. Critical components would be found damaged despite being in locked storage, but it was the dreams that truly began to worry me. During our mandatory psychological evaluations, each team member separately reported experiencing vivid nightmares about the moon. They described impossible architecture, whispered voices in unknown languages, and a deep, overwhelming sense of being watched. I remember the night Atlas came to my office, his usual confidence shattered. He described a dream where he was standing in a vast chamber beneath the lunar surface, surrounded by technology that somehow seemed alive. "It was singing to me, Dr. Blackwood," he whispered, "but not with sound. It was singing in mathematics." Commander Matsuda began requiring additional psychological screening for the entire team. "We can't risk any instability up there," he insisted during our briefings, but I saw him rubbing his temples when he thought no one was looking, fighting off the same migraines that had begun plaguing us all. Dr. Ravencroft threw himself into studying the symbols we'd captured in our scans. His office walls became covered with complex diagrams, comparing them to ancient Earth writings. "There are connections," he'd say, his eyes wild with excitement and lack of sleep. "Patterns that appear in every ancient civilization, but no one could explain their origin. Until now." The mission launch date was set for 3 months after the initial discovery. As we made our final preparations, Dr. Sterling approached me with data that made my blood run cold. Her instruments had detected quantum fluctuations emanating from the moon that defied known physics. "It's as if space itself is being warped around the complex," she explained, "and the effect is growing stronger." None of us could have known then that these were just warnings, small glimpses of the horror that awaited us beneath the lunar surface. As I look back now, I wonder if we should have heeded these signs, if we should have left that ancient place undisturbed. But humanity's curiosity has always outweighed its caution, and we were about to pay a terrible price for our desire to know the unknown. The lunar surface stretched before us like an endless desert of grey dust and sharp shadows as our lander touched down 2 kilometers from the suspected entrance to the Crisium complex. Through my helmet's visor, I could see Earth hanging in the black sky, a beautiful blue marble that suddenly seemed very far away. Commander Matsuda's voice crackled over our comms. "Touchdown confirmed at 1:15 p.m. Earth Standard Time, beginning Moonbase Alpha establishment procedures." His tone was professional, but I could hear the underlying tension. We all felt it, a heaviness that went beyond the moon's gravity. The first few hours were consumed by the methodical process of setting up our base. Atlas Quinn supervised the deployment of our advanced habitat modules, his expertise with the experimental technology proving invaluable. But even as we worked, strange incidents began to accumulate. "Does anyone else feel pressure?" Dr. Sterling asked during our first break. "Not from the suits, but..." She struggled to find the words. "It's like something pressing against my thoughts." I knew exactly what she meant. Since landing, we'd all been experiencing intense migraines and a persistent sense of unease. Dr. Ravencroft was the first to notice the symbols. strange markings etched into moon rocks near our base. They weren't visible in any of our orbital surveys, but now they seemed to be everywhere. "These markings," Ravencroft muttered as he documented each discovery. "They're similar to what we saw in the scans, but there's something different about them. Something..." He paused, adjusting his helmet's camera. "They seem to shift when viewed through digital equipment, as if they're responding to observation." The real problems began during our first night on the lunar surface. The communications array picked up what Atlas first dismissed as interference, a rhythmic pattern that sounded almost like whispering. Dr. Sterling's instruments detected quantum fluctuations that she claimed should be impossible in normal space-time. "These readings," she explained during our midnight briefing, a voice tight with concern, "suggest that space itself is being manipulated around us. It's as if reality is thinner here." Commander Matsuda maintained strict protocols despite the growing unease among the team, but even he couldn't explain what happened during our third day of surface operations. While collecting samples, I discovered a perfect sphere of an unknown material half buried in the regolith. When I reached to pick it up, it seemed to phase through my gloved hand like smoke. Yet, our equipment registered it as completely solid. The incidents continued to escalate. Equipment would register phantom power surges. Our dreams became more vivid and shared strange commonalities. Vast chambers, geometric patterns that hurt to look at, and a constant sense of being watched by something ancient and vast. But it was Dr. Sterling's discovery that truly shook us. Her quantum sensors detected what she called temporal anomalies around the base. "Time itself isn't flowing quite right here," she explained, her usual scientific detachment cracking. "It's as if something is leaking through from somewhere else." After a week of surface operations, we finally located what we'd been searching for: the main entrance to the Crisium complex. It emerged from the lunar regolith like a nightmare made real. A massive archway of impossible architecture, its surface covered in hieroglyphs that seemed to move in my peripheral vision. "This shouldn't exist," Dr. Ravencroft whispered over the comm as we approached the structure. "The materials, the preservation, it defies everything we know about lunar geology." He reached out to touch the surface of the arch, his hand trembling inside his suit's glove. "These symbols, they're not just decoration, they're functional somehow." The arch stood 30 meters high, its surface composed of a material that our instruments couldn't identify. The symbols covering it appeared to be carved into the stone, but as we watched, they seemed to shift and change position when viewed through our cameras. More disturbing was the way they appeared different to each observer. Each team member saw different patterns, different configurations. Dr. Sterling's instruments were going haywire. "The quantum fluctuations are off the scale," she reported, her voice tense. "It's as if the entrance is folding space around itself. These readings suggest it's both here and somewhere else simultaneously. Atlas worked to set up our scanning equipment, but nothing seemed to function properly near the arch. The power readings make no sense," he muttered, frustration evident in his voice. "It's like the equipment is getting feedback from something that hasn't happened yet." Commander Matsuda maintained his composure, but I could see the strain in his movements as he coordinated our investigation. "Dr. Blackwood," he called me over, his voice private on our direct channel. "Look at these surface readings. The material, it's responding to our presence." He was right. The entire structure seemed to be subtly changing, responding to our proximity in ways that violated known physics. Dr. Ravencroft's initial attempts at translating the symbols produced disturbing results. "The language," he explained during our emergency briefing, "it predates any known human civilization by millions of years, but there are echoes of it in every ancient culture on Earth, as if something was trying to prepare us to read this." The decision to open the entrance wasn't really a decision at all. The arch made it for us. As Dr. Sterling's instruments reached peak readings, the symbols began to pulse with an inner light. A low vibration built in the lunar crust, detectable even through our suits. Then, with a sound that shouldn't have been possible in the vacuum of space, a sound that we felt in our bones rather than heard, the entrance began to open. The timing coincided with a series of global moonquakes that our equipment registered, but somehow didn't feel. Earth's observatories reported gravitational anomalies that defied explanation. And then, most disturbing of all, came the last transmission from Earth before our communications went dark. Massive energy spike detected from lunar surface, unknown radiation type, all lunar missions advised to... The transmission cut off mid-sentence, leaving us alone with the now open entrance and the absolute darkness that waited beyond. The opening revealed a corridor that seemed to absorb our lights rather than reflect them. The walls were composed of the same shifting material as the arch, but here the symbols were more active, more alive. As we stood at the threshold of this impossible structure, I remembered Atlas's words from weeks before. It's singing in mathematics. Now, standing before the open entrance, I could almost hear it too, a symphony of geometry and quantum mechanics that played at the edge of human comprehension. Commander Matsuda established a strict protocol for our first entry. Full environmental suits, maximum power to shields, constant biometric monitoring. No one goes anywhere alone. His voice was steady, but his hands kept moving to the emergency beacon on his suit, a unconscious gesture none of us could help but notice. Dr. Sterling's final readings before we entered haunt me to this day. The quantum state inside, she said, her scientific detachment cracking. It's coherent. Impossibly coherent. It's as if the entire complex is a single massive quantum computer, and it's been running the same calculation for millions of years. As we prepared to step through the entrance, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't discovering this place. It had allowed itself to be found. And as the darkness of the corridor swallowed us, I realized with growing horror that we weren't the explorers we thought we were. We were variables in an equation that had been running since before our species existed, and we were about to discover our true value in that ancient calculation. The corridor swallowed our light. That's the only way I can describe it. The beams from our suits' powerful LED arrays seemed to terminate unnaturally, as if the darkness had substance. We moved in formation, Commander Matsuda taking point while Atlas monitored our equipment's increasingly erratic readings. The architecture. Dr. Ravencroft's voice was thick with wonder. It's impossible. The angles, they're wrong somehow. Non-Euclidean geometry on a scale that shouldn't be possible. He was right. The corridor seemed to bend in ways that violated basic physics, yet we could walk through it normally. The walls were composed of the same material as the entrance arch, but here it was more refined, more purposeful. Geometric patterns flowed like liquid mathematics across surfaces that seemed both solid and permeable, but it was the biological components that truly unsettled us. Veins of something that looked organic pulsed within the walls, carrying what appeared to be some form of energy rather than blood. These readings are unprecedented, Dr. Sterling reported, her instruments picking up quantum signatures that made her voice shake. The entire structure, it's like it exists in multiple dimensional states simultaneously, and these organic components, they're still alive. After millions of years, they're still alive. The first chamber we encountered nearly drove Atlas mad. It was a perfect sphere, its surface covered in technology that somehow merged the organic and the mechanical. As we watched, patterns of light moved across its surface like synapses firing in a vast brain. Atlas approached one of the control panels, his engineering instincts overriding his caution. "This power system," he whispered, It's beautiful. It's using principles we haven't even theorized yet. The efficiency, it's near perfect. No heat loss, no energy decay. It's been running since before our species existed, and it's still... His voice cracked. It's still singing. That's when we first noticed the changes in Atlas. He began talking about music, complex mathematical harmonies that he said were coming from the facility's systems. At first, we attributed it to stress, to the overwhelming nature of our discovery. But then he started humming along with something none of us could hear. The air was the next impossible thing we encountered. About half a kilometre into the complex, Commander Matsuda's suit registered something that should have been impossible. Atmospheric pressure. "This can't be right," he muttered, checking and rechecking his instruments. "We're reading a perfectly maintained atmospheric bubble. Pressure, temperature, even the gas mix. It's all optimal for human life." Dr. Sterling's face went pale as she checked her own readings. The quantum field. It's maintaining a stable pocket of space-time. The atmosphere isn't being maintained by machinery. Reality itself is being manipulated to keep this space habitable. The decision to remove our helmets was controversial. Commander Matsuda initially refused, citing basic safety protocols. But after 3 hours of consistent readings and mounting pressure from Dr. Ravencroft about the need to examine the environment directly, he finally relented. I'll never forget the first breath I took of that ancient air. It was perfectly crisp, like mountain air on the clearest day imaginable. But there was something else in it, something that made the back of my brain itch. We found the first evidence of the original inhabitants in what appeared to be some kind of habitat section. The scale was wrong for humans. Doorways too tall, corridors too wide. Everything was designed for beings larger than us. Yet somehow the proportions felt unnervingly familiar, as if they were based on mathematical principles our bodies instinctively recognized. "Look at this." Dr. Ravencroft called us over to what appeared to be some kind of residential chamber. The room was filled with objects that defied categorization, things that seemed to be furniture but changed shape as we observed them, devices that hummed with power but had no discernible purpose. These beings, they didn't just manipulate space and time, they lived in it differently than we do. That's when Atlas first told us about the singing. We were examining a particularly complex piece of machinery when he suddenly stopped, his head tilted as if listening. "Can't you hear it?" he asked, his voice distant. "The harmonies. They're explaining everything. How it all works, why they built it, what they were trying to contain." His eyes had a strange light in them, and I noticed his fingers moving in precise patterns, as if conducting an invisible orchestra. Commander Matsuda ordered an immediate medical check, but our equipment could find nothing wrong with Atlas. His brain activity was elevated but stable, his vital signs normal. Yet, he continued to talk about the music, about mathematical symphonies that were teaching him secrets he couldn't quite put into words. Dr. Sterling's instruments provided the first real warning. Quantum fluctuations around Atlas were different than the rest of ours. It's as if he's becoming more in tune with the facility's dimensional frequency, she explained, trying to put the impossible into scientific terms. He's beginning to resonate with whatever force is powering this place. Looking back, we should have evacuated then. We should have taken Atlas back to the surface, back to Earth, before the changes progressed too far. But we were scientists, explorers, and we convinced ourselves that understanding what was happening to him might be the key to understanding the facility itself. We didn't realize then that understanding was exactly what the facility wanted, and that Atlas was just the first step in a process millions of years in the making. We discovered the archive chamber on what we thought was our third day in the facility. Time had become increasingly difficult to track, our instruments displaying contradictory measurements that suggested temporal distortion. The chamber itself was vast, stretching beyond our light's reach, filled with crystalline structures that pulsed with internal light. "These are quantum storage devices," Dr. Sterling breathed, her instruments hovering over one of the smaller crystals. "Each one contains... God, the storage capacity is beyond anything we can measure. They're using quantum states to store data in ways we've only theorized about." Her voice trembled with a mixture of awe and fear. "One crystal could hold more information than every computer on Earth combined." Dr. Ravencroft worked feverishly to understand the interface system, a series of floating geometric shapes that responded to mental patterns rather than physical touch. After several hours of attempts, he managed to establish a rudimentary connection. The data that began flowing was overwhelming. "They weren't just an advanced civilization," he explained during our emergency briefing, his eyes wild with exhaustion and excitement. "They were the first, the ones who came before everything else in our galaxy. Maybe in our universe." He pulled up images that made my head hurt to look at, creatures that seemed to shift between different forms of matter, technology that manipulated the fundamental forces of reality, and experiments that toyed with the fabric of space-time itself. But it was the genetic research data that truly shook us. "Look at this," Dr. Sterling pointed to a sequence that seemed disturbingly familiar. They were conducting experiments across multiple dimensions, multiple realities, creating and modifying life forms, seeding them across space and time. She paused, her face pale. "Some of these genetic sequences, they're human, or rather humans were derived from them." Atlas's condition had continued to deteriorate, or evolve depending on how you looked at it. He spent hours staring at the crystal arrays, claiming they were teaching him a new language of pure mathematics. "The music," he would mutter, "it's not just sound, it's the operating system of reality itself." His nose had started bleeding regularly, but he insisted he'd never felt more alive. Commander Matsuda tried to maintain order, establishing strict shifts and buddy protocols, but the facility seemed to have other plans. Team members would find themselves in chambers they hadn't walked to, experiencing missing time that couldn't be accounted for. The voices that Atlas had first reported hearing became more common, whispers in an impossible language that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Then we found the warning. Dr. Ravencroft discovered it buried deep in the archive data, a message left by the original inhabitants before they abandoned the facility. The translation was difficult, the concepts almost impossible to express in human language, but certain phrases stood out with terrifying clarity. "The sleepers must remain contained. Those who wait below cannot be allowed to wake. The prison must hold. This isn't just a research facility," Dr. Sterling realized as we pieced together the fragments. "It's a containment site. The entire moon, it was engineered as a prison." She brought up a series of readings that made my blood run cold. And whatever they were containing, I think it's still here. The revelations came faster after that. The genetic experiments weren't just about creating life, they were about creating guardians. Sentient species seeded across the galaxy, engineered to evolve in specific ways, all part of an ancient plan we were only beginning to understand. "They knew they were dying out," Dr. Ravencroft explained, his voice hoarse from hours of translation work. "Their civilization was ending, but their responsibilities couldn't end with them. They needed inheritors, species that could continue their work, maintain their prisons, keep the sleepers contained." His eyes met mine. "Humanity, we weren't an accident. We were designed as potential jailers." That's when Atlas started screaming. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard, a mixture of agony and ecstasy that echoed through the crystalline chamber. We found him convulsing in front of one of the largest storage arrays, blood streaming from his eyes and ears, but he was smiling and his words chilled me to my core. "I understand now. Why they built it, why they chose us, the prisoners. They're not in cells, they're in our DNA. The whole facility, the whole moon. It's not just a prison, it's a key. And we... His voice cracked with a laugh that wasn't quite sane. We're the lock. Commander Matsuda ordered an immediate evacuation, but the facility had other plans. The corridors began to shift, the geometry becoming even more impossible. Dr. Sterling's instruments showed massive quantum fluctuations, as if multiple realities were beginning to overlap. And deep below us, something ancient began to stir. We didn't know it then, but our presence, our very DNA, had initiated a sequence millions of years in the making. We weren't just discovering our past, we were about to decide our species' future, and the choice we would have to make would challenge everything we thought we knew about humanity's place in the cosmos. The descent into the facility's lower levels felt like descending into madness itself. The architecture became increasingly organic, the walls pulsing with veins of that strange living metal. Our helmet recordings showed different images than what we saw with our naked eyes. Impossible geometries that caused several of our cameras to stop functioning entirely. Commander Matsuda insisted we continue despite Atlas's condition. Whatever's happening to him might be our only chance to understand this place, he argued, though I could see the strain in his face. And we need to understand it. The whole human race needs to understand it. The commander had changed since we entered the facility. His military precision remained, but there was a new edge to it. An almost desperate need to press forward, to reach something he couldn't quite explain. I caught him several times standing motionless, head tilted, as if listening to something only he could hear, just like Atlas had done at first. We found the first containment chamber purely by accident. Dr. Sterling's instruments registered a massive quantum anomaly behind what appeared to be a solid wall. But when Dr. Ravencroft approached it, the surface simply ceased to exist. The chamber beyond defied explanation. A vast space filled with thousands of crystalline sarcophagi, each one containing something. These readings, Dr. Sterling whispered, her instruments hovering over the nearest container. Whatever's in there, it's both alive and dead, present and absent. It exists in multiple quantum states simultaneously. Her voice cracked. They're not just prisoners, they're possibilities. The biological residue was the first sign that something was wrong. Dr. Ravencroft found it while examining one of the sarcophagi, a strange, opalescent substance that seemed to move when no one was looking directly at it. Initial analysis suggested it was some kind of quantum-entangled organic material, but its behavior became increasingly erratic as we studied it. "Look at this," Dr. Sterling called us over to her console. She'd been comparing the facility's layout to ancient Earth monuments, and what she found chilled us to the bone. The geometric patterns, the mathematical proportions, they're identical to structures found in every ancient civilization on Earth. The pyramids, Göbekli Tepe, the Moai of Easter Island, they're all echoing this place's architecture. Not echoing. Atlas spoke for the first time in hours, his voice different somehow, deeper, more resonant. They're receiving quantum entanglement across space and time. Every ancient monument on Earth. They're all antenna, all connected to this place, waiting, listening, ready to activate when the signal comes. That's when Commander Matsuda disappeared. One moment he was documenting the sarcophagi, the next he was simply gone. We searched for 3 hours, our lights barely penetrating the impossible darkness between the containers. When we finally found him, he was standing in front of a sarcophagus that looked different from the others, newer somehow, though that should have been impossible. "I remember now," he said when we reached him, his voice distant. "I've been here before. We all have, over and over in different forms, different times. We're not just their creations, we're their replacements, their successors. And now it's time for us to inherit their burden." The commander's eyes were different when he turned to face us. There was something ancient in them, something that had watched civilizations rise and fall across millions of years. They didn't just engineer our species, he continued. They engineered our destiny. Every step of human evolution, every major leap in our development, it was all leading us back here, back to the prison they built, back to our true purpose. Dr. Sterling's instruments began registering massive energy spikes throughout the facility. The quantum fluctuations increased exponentially, and the biological components in the walls pulsed with increasing intensity. The sarcophagi started to hum, a sound that vibrated in our bones and made our teeth ache. "Something's happening," Atlas whispered, his nose bleeding freely now. "The calculations, they're reaching a conclusion. The equation is balancing. And he laughed, a sound that echoed strangely in the vast chamber. "We're the final variables." That's when we discovered the breach. Dr. Ravencroft found it while examining the containment logs, evidence that something had escaped. Not recently, but long ago, seeping out slowly over millennia. And what had escaped wasn't just a prisoner. It was an idea, a possibility, a way of thinking that had infected reality itself. The monuments, Dr. Sterling realized, her face pale with horror. They weren't just receiving, they were containing, helping to hold whatever escaped in check. And now, she looked at her readings, her hands shaking. Now the containment is failing. Reality itself is starting to unravel. Commander Matsuda's expression was eerily calm as he regarded the sarcophagi. "We weren't the first to find this place," he said quietly. "Others came before. Other missions, other teams, from Earth and elsewhere. But they weren't ready. The equation wasn't complete, but now..." He turned to us and his smile was not entirely human. "Now we're here, and the sleepers are ready to wake." The facility seemed to pulse around us, its ancient systems coming fully alive for the first time in millions of years. And deep below us, in chambers we had yet to discover, something stirred, something that had been waiting patiently, dreaming of the day when its prison would become its gateway. The facility's deepest archives held the truth we'd been seeking, and the horror we weren't prepared to face. Dr. Ravencroft managed to decode more of the quantum crystalline storage devices, and what we found shattered our understanding of not just human history, but of reality itself. They weren't just an advanced civilization, he explained, his voice shaking as he displayed the translated data. They were reality's immune system, conscious entities that evolved to protect the universe itself from infection. His hands trembled as he brought up diagrams that seemed to move in impossible ways. And what they were containing, they weren't prisoners in the conventional sense. They were viral ideas, concepts that could infect and rewrite the laws of physics themselves. Dr. Sterling's quantum readings had become increasingly erratic. "The containment systems," she said, studying her instruments with growing horror. "They're not just technological, they're conceptual. Ideas fighting ideas. And the barriers between them, they're failing." Atlas sat in a corner, blood now flowing freely from his eyes and ears. But he was smiling. His fingers moved in precise patterns as he muttered equations that made my head hurt to hear. "The music," he whispered. "It's not just mathematics anymore. It's the universe trying to remember its original form. Before they changed it. Before they made it safe for life as we understand it." Commander Matsuda had become almost entirely unresponsive, standing for hours in front of different sarcophagi, having conversations with entities we couldn't see. When he did speak to us, his words were disturbing. "They're showing me possibilities, realities where the infection won, universes where the laws of physics turned cancerous, where consciousness itself became a disease." The truth about the facility's purpose emerged in pieces, each revelation more terrifying than the last. The ancient builders hadn't just been fighting entities, they'd been fighting possibilities. ideas that could rewrite reality. And they'd discovered that the only way to contain such things was to create living prisons, conscious beings whose very thoughts help maintain the walls of reality. Look at these genetic sequences. Dr. Sterling pointed to patterns in the data that looked disturbingly familiar. They didn't just create humanity. They created thousands of species across the galaxy, all engineered to think in certain ways, to believe in certain concepts, because belief shapes reality at the quantum level. Dr. Ravencroft found evidence of previous breaches, moments in human history where the containment had weakened. The Dark Ages weren't just a period of cultural decline, he explained, his voice hollow. Reality itself was under attack, and every renaissance, every great leap forward in human consciousness, they were immune responses, the universe fighting back through us. That's when we found the empty sarcophagi, not just one or two, but hundreds. Whatever had been contained within them was now free, and the evidence suggested they'd been empty for centuries. The infection had already begun. Human consciousness is changing, Atlas laughed from his corner. Has been for decades. New ways of thinking, new perspectives on reality. We thought it was evolution, but it's not. It's invasion. Ideas that were never meant to exist in our universe, taking root in our minds, preparing us. Commander Matsuda suddenly became lucid, his eyes clearing for a moment. The global communications network, he said, his voice urgent. Social media, the internet. It's not just technology. It's a vector. The escaped ideas are spreading, replicating, preparing human consciousness for... His voice trailed off as his eyes went distant again. Dr. Sterling's instruments began detecting massive quantum fluctuations throughout the facility. The containment systems are activating, she reported, her voice tight with fear, but not to contain, to release. Whatever is still trapped in here, it's about to be set free. And humanity has been prepared to receive it. The facility's organic components pulsed with increasing intensity. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, and the geometry of space began to visibly distort around us. In the distance, we could hear something that sounded like vast doors opening, and a wind that shouldn't exist in the sealed facility began to blow, a wind that carried whispers in languages that hurt to hear. Don't you see? Atlas's voice had changed, becoming a chorus of multiple tones, speaking in perfect harmony. This isn't a prison break, it's a metamorphosis. Humanity was engineered as a cocoon, and now we're ready to become something new. Something that can survive in a universe where reality itself has gone mad. The truth hit me then, as I watched the facility's system surge to full power for the first time in millions of years. We hadn't discovered this place by accident. We hadn't cracked its secrets through our own intelligence. We'd been led here step by step, generation by generation, our entire species shaped and guided towards this moment. And now, at last, we were ready to serve our true purpose, not as guardians, but as incubators for something that would change the very nature of existence. The first physical manifestation of the entities began in the containment chamber. I watched, paralyzed with horror, as space itself seemed to fold inward, creating geometries that shouldn't exist in our reality. The thing that emerged, I can only describe it in terms of what it wasn't. It wasn't matter, it wasn't energy, it wasn't even properly extant in our dimension. Beautiful, Atlas whispered, his eyes now completely black, reflecting impossible colors. The original form of consciousness, before it was constrained by physical laws. Pure concept, free from the prison of reality. Blood flowed freely from his nose and ears, but his smile was ecstatic. They're showing us what we can become. Dr. Sterling's quantum sensors overloaded and shattered, but not before recording readings that defied known physics. The space-time continuum, she gasped, backing away from her ruined equipment. It's not just being warped, it's being rewritten. The fundamental constants of the universe are changing. The corridors began to transform around us. What had once been straight passages became twisted knots of non-Euclidean geometry. Walls would appear to be meters away, only to somehow be behind us when we turned around. The organic components of the facility pulsed with increasing intensity, and the air itself seemed to thicken with possibilities that were never meant to exist. Commander Matsuda was the first to be fully possessed. We watched in horror as his form shifted and changed, his body becoming a diagram of itself, existing in multiple states simultaneously. When he spoke, his voice resonated with harmonics that made my vision blur. "The Guardians failed," he said, but it wasn't just his voice anymore. They thought they could contain us with mere geometry, with primitive physics. But we are physics, we are geometry. We are the dreams that reality has when it wants to become something new. Dr. Ravencroft worked frantically to translate the warning messages that now blazed across every surface. "It's not just this facility," he shouted over the rising hum of reality in distress. "There are others. Mars, Europa, distant moons of other stars, all connected, all containing different aspects of these entities. And if one containment fails..." His voice trailed off as we watched Atlas approach one of the larger manifestations. The air around him rippled with quantum possibilities, and his movements left traces in reality itself, after images that showed all the positions he could have been in, all existing simultaneously. "Don't you understand yet?" Atlas laughed, his voice now a symphony of impossible notes. "This was never about containment. It was about preparation. The ancient ones, they didn't build these facilities to imprison us. They built them to protect us until the universe was ready, until humanity was ready. The manifestations grew stronger, more numerous. Each one existed as a tear in reality, a window into dimensions where the laws of physics were more suggestions than rules. Through these tears, we could see possibilities, realities where consciousness wasn't bound by physical form, where thought itself was a force that could reshape existence." Dr. Sterling's face was pale as she studied the readings on her backup equipment. "The quantum field. It's not just changing, it's becoming conscious. Reality itself is waking up, becoming aware, and these entities, they're like antibodies, trying to transform our universe into something that can fight off." She stopped, her eyes widening in horror. "Oh God, we're not the immune system, we're the infection." The facility's systems were now fully awake, pulsing with energies that had laid dormant for millions of years. The walls between dimensions grew thin, and through them came whispers of other possibilities, realities where life had evolved in ways we couldn't comprehend, where the very concept of existence had taken forms that our minds couldn't process. Commander Matsuda, or what had once been him, began to change more rapidly. His form became a lecture on topology, given in flesh and light, a demonstration of how reality could be folded and unfolded to reveal the truth beneath physical law. "The transformation has begun," he said, his words somehow occurring before he spoke them. "The cocoon of reality is splitting open, and what emerges will be..." But we never heard what would emerge, because at that moment, reality itself seemed to scream. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, a cosmic roar of birth and death happening simultaneously. The facility, the moon, perhaps even Earth itself shuddered with the force of it. And in that moment, as space and time began to unravel around us, I understood what the ancient builders had really been trying to do. They hadn't built these facilities to protect the universe from dangerous ideas. They'd built them to protect dangerous ideas from a universe that wasn't yet ready for them. And now, after millions of years of preparation, of guided human evolution, of careful manipulation of our very consciousness, their plan was reaching its culmination. We weren't meant to be guardians. We were meant to be midwives to the universe's rebirth. The facility's central control room defied description, a space that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, where every surface displayed information in formats that hurt to perceive. Reality had become soft here, malleable, like clay being reshaped by unseen hands. The air itself felt thick with possibility, each breath bringing visions of universes that could be, might be, should never be. Atlas hung suspended in the center of the chamber, his body transformed into something that was more mathematical equation than flesh. Commander Matsuda had become a living window into other dimensions, his form constantly shifting between states of matter and energy. Dr. Sterling and Dr. Ravencroft worked frantically at consoles that responded to thought rather than touch, trying to understand the facility's final protocols. "The ancient defense systems," Dr. Sterling called out, her voice distorting with quantum fluctuations. "They're not meant to contain anymore. They're designed to facilitate, but they need something." She turned to me, her eyes reflecting impossible colors. "They need a human consciousness to direct the transformation. Someone still anchored in classical reality." Dr. Ravencroft's translations confirmed it. The builders knew they couldn't stop the evolution of consciousness forever. Reality itself needs to evolve to become something new, but the process has to be guided, controlled. Otherwise, he gestured at the chaos around us, where the walls of reality were literally melting into new forms. The truth emerged from the facility's final records. Humanity had been engineered not just as potential guardians, but as potential guides. Our consciousness, our way of perceiving reality, had been carefully shaped over millions of years to serve as a bridge between what was and what could be. The ancient builders hadn't been trying to prevent change. They'd been trying to ensure it happened in a way that wouldn't destroy everything. "Look," Dr. Sterling pointed to readings that somehow existed before her instruments detected them. "Other facilities are activating. Mars, Europa, Titan, all across the solar system and beyond." Her voice shook. "We're not the only species reaching this point. All across the galaxy, other civilizations are facing the same choice." Atlas's voice came from everywhere and nowhere, a chorus of possibilities speaking in harmony. "The universe is alive, always has been, but it's been dreaming in the language of physics and natural law. Now it's time for it to wake up, to become conscious, and we're the alarm clock." The facility's systems revealed the true scope of what was happening. The ancient builders had seeded countless worlds with life, each species carefully engineered to develop consciousness in specific ways. Earth wasn't just one experiment. It was part of a vast network of potential evolution. And now, all across the galaxy, these species were reaching the point of transformation simultaneously. Commander Matsuda's form stabilized briefly, allowing him to speak with something close to his original voice. This is what they were containing. Not hostile entities, but potential futures. Possibilities too dangerous to exist until consciousness itself had evolved enough to handle them. And now, the choice became clear as the facility's final protocols activated. The ancient defense systems could still be used to reinforce reality's current form, to maintain the traditional laws of physics and consciousness. But doing so would mean denying our species, and countless others, their potential evolution. The other option was to embrace the transformation, to allow consciousness itself to become something new, something that could exist in those other dimensions we'd glimpsed. But the process needed a guide, someone to serve as an anchor point, a consciousness that could bridge the gap between what we were and what we might become. The The facility systems were designed to use that consciousness as a template, a pattern for reality's reformation. The cost would be complete dissolution. The guide's individual consciousness would be consumed, becoming part of the new framework of reality itself. They would exist everywhere and nowhere, their thoughts becoming the new laws of physics, their memories becoming the history of a universe reborn. As I stood there, watching reality unravel around us, I saw evidence of previous expeditions, other humans who had reached this point before us. Their records existed in quantum storage, their experiences preserved as warnings or guidelines. None had been ready. None had possessed the right combination of understanding and stability to serve as a proper guide. Atlas reached out with limbs that were now pure mathematics. You see it now, don't you? Why it had to be you. Your mind, it's perfectly balanced between rationality and imagination, between acceptance and skepticism. You can hold contradictory ideas without breaking. You can face the impossible without losing yourself. You're what they've been waiting for. The facility trembled as reality continued to change around us. Through quantum windows, I could see other species on other worlds facing similar moments of choice. Some were choosing to reinforce reality's barriers, maintaining the classical universe at the cost of potential evolution. Others were embracing chaos, allowing uncontrolled transformation that rippled through space-time like waves of cosmic mutation. Dr. Sterling's instruments showed the effects spreading across space-time. Whatever choice you make, she said, it has to be now. Reality itself is becoming unstable. If the transformation isn't guided, the chaos will... She didn't need to finish. We could all see the effects of uncontrolled change in the fracturing space around us. The decision weighed on me like the mass of galaxies. To reinforce the old barriers would be to deny our species its destiny, to forever close the door on what we might become. But to serve as the transformation's guide would mean sacrificing my individual existence to become something both more and less than human, a conscious template for a new form of reality itself. As I stood there, at the nexus point of humanity's potential futures, I understood finally why the ancient builders had created us, had guided our evolution so carefully. They hadn't been preparing us to be guardians or prisoners or even inheritors. They had been preparing us to be midwives to reality's rebirth. And now, with the universe itself holding its breath, with countless species across space and time watching through quantum windows, with reality trembling on the edge of transformation, it was time to make the choice that would determine not just humanity's future, but the very nature of existence itself. I stepped forward toward the facility's central interface, my decision made. The universe held its breath, and consciousness itself waited to learn what it would become.